Welcome to the Introductory Tax Administration lecture. My name is Wusim Caesar. In this lecture, I am going to try to put into context as to how the tax administration module fits in with the South African tax system. In doing so, I will begin with an overview of the South African tax system. Within the tax system in South Africa, you will find that there are various stakeholders that play a role. One of the stakeholders is the government. We also have civil society or ordinary taxpayers. The relation between these two stakeholders is governed by what we call a social contract. In terms of this social contract, the government will make an undertaking to provide public goods and services to the civil society or to the citizens of the country. In return, the civil society or the ordinary citizens of the country or the taxpayers will have to make an undertaking to contribute or to make contributions towards the provision of these goods and services. In order to facilitate this social contract, the government created an SPV in the form of the South African Revenue Services. This SPV, or the South African Revenue Services, was formed in terms of an Act of Parliament. The Act of Parliament in question, known as the South African Revenue Services Act number 34 of 1997. In terms of this act, the primary function of the South African Revenue Services is to collect the contributions from the civil society or from the citizens of the country. These contributions are known as taxes. These taxes or these contributions will go towards enabling the government to provide the goods and services as promised or as undertaken to the civil society. Once collected, these contributions will then be handed over to the National Treasury. The National Treasury is a department within government or within the public sector, and it is tasked with managing all the funds that are raised on behalf of government. It is also tasked with the allocation of these funds that are raised on behalf of government for the purposes of providing all the public goods and services to the civil society. The allocation, therefore, of this contribution is usually presented to the general public in terms of the annual budget by the finance minister. This happens every year in February. In the main, the focus of this module or the focus of the TAX3704 revolves around the relationship between the South African Revenue Services and the tax-paying community or the civil society. Why SARS? SARS, as mentioned previously, was established in terms of an Act of Parliament, and the primary function of SARS or the mandate of SARS in terms of this act is to ensure that every person, as defined under a tax act, contributes their fair share to the National Revenue Fund. The National Revenue Fund, I did touch on it a little bit in the previous slide. The National Revenue Fund is essentially a fund into which all the funds that are raised on behalf of government, being the contributions from the ordinary taxpayers or the ordinary citizens, and the funds that are raised in the bond market I'm sure you have heard a little bit about government bonds and also other sources of funding from the likes of the IMF, from the likes of the World Bank, or the Development Bank of the Southern Africa, and from the other commercial banks. To put it simply, the National Revenue Fund is equivalent to a bank account or a credit card facility of government. How does it all work out? The South African Revenue Services has been given administrative powers over a number of taxes and levies, duties, examples of which I have listed, amongst which is the value-added tax, the income tax, which are also known as fiscal statutes or fiscal legislations. SARS can enforce taxpayer registration. SARS can enforce honesty in disclosures. SARS is also empowered in terms of this fiscal statutes to enforce the filing of tax returns by a particular date. SARS is also empowered to enforce the recovery of any tax amount or tax debt or any amounts that are due under any assessment that has been legally issued to any taxpayer. Why the Tax Administration Act? As mentioned previously, that SARS was created as an SPV or a special purpose vehicle within government. Therefore, it is often referred to as a government agency or as an administrative organ of government. The Tax Administration Act came about as a result of several observations of instances in which public power was abused by government agencies, government departments, and other entities within government in dealing with the ordinary South Africans or the civil society. So this was in pursuant to Section 33 of the Constitution of the Republic. This section requires government to enact or to introduce legislations with the purpose or with the aim of safeguarding against any abuse of public power by its agencies, departments, or entities, or to ensure a fair administrative action. So essentially, the Tax Administration Act is founded on the principles that are laid out in the Promotion of Administrative Justice Act, also known as PAJA. We will not be looking at PAJA as part of this module. Therefore, you can ignore it because it was just for information purposes. Continuing with the Tax Administration Act, in simple terms, it is a law or legislation that governs the relations between the SARS as an organ of the state and the civil society. This law, as I mentioned previously, was enacted or was introduced to fulfill the requirements of the Section 33 of the Constitution of the Republic of South Africa. This section specifically prescribes that everyone has a right to an administrative action that is lawful, reasonable, and procedurally fair. Now, looking at the module, the primary purpose of the Tax Administration Act essentially was to combine into one legislation all the generic administrative provisions which were previously duplicated in various tax acts. In the past, all the tax acts administered by the South African Revenue Services used to have their own administrative provision. For example, you will find that in the VAT Act, there were registration requirements. In the Income Tax Act, there were also registration requirements. In the donations tax or in the customs and excise duties, or PAYE or SDL or UIF, they all had their registration requirement, for example. In order to remove this duplication, all of these provisions were now combined into this single piece of legislation that we know as the Tax Administration Act. So some of the other generic provisions that were duplicated included the submission or the filing of tax returns and the requirements to keep records. This also included the issuance of tax assessments and the dispute resolution processes. And lastly, the generic administrative provisions also included in the various tax acts were the provisions of the recovery of the tax debts or the outstanding tax amount. On the whole, and as you can see, these are the key administrative provisions. I mean, this is the core of the Tax Administration Act. It is the core of the TAX3704. This should act as a guideline for you in your studies. It should also act as a guideline in terms of connecting the dots. The Tax Administration Act is all about the taxpayer registration requirements. It's all about the submission or the filing of tax returns. It is all about the recovery of the tax debts or the outstanding taxes as assessed under various tax acts. As you can see, I mean, the Tax Administration Act revolves around these 4 provisions. So for your purposes, I would want to urge you guys to try and make the connections, try and connect these provisions. I actually call this the pillars of the Tax Administration Act. Once you understand that the relationship between SARS and the taxpayers or the tax-paying community is essentially based on these 4 provisions. So in simple terms, without these provisions, SARS will never be able to achieve their mandate or to carry out their mandate. At some point, they'll have to have powers to force people to register for tax. They'll have to be in a position to force a submission of returns. They'll have to be in a position to issue assessments. They'll have to be in a position to recover the taxes. As mentioned previously, then in our next lecture, I'll look at the provisions of registration. I'll look at the provisions of submission or filing of tax returns. Thank you so much. See you in the next video.